Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's podcast. I hope we didn't catch you napping, being slightly earlier than usual, but we're trying to show that our ability to deliver a service can be done. Delivery can be done. Service can be provided. I've got with me Chris Hattingh. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks,
And
Sara.
Gerbrandt van Heerden, both Center for Risk Analysis. So it's like one IRR person and them. So let's see what the CRA has to offer us today. I think the first news, and we don't need to go into very much detail about it, but it's significant in the sense of it passes a milestone which we need like a hole in the head, and that is that the National Health Insurance Bill has been approved by Parliament. And what this essentially means is that now that Parliament's approved it, the bill goes on to the National Council of Provinces, where they will approve it. I'm being a bit cynical here, but they will approve it, and then it goes to the President's desk to sign it into law. Now, we've talked at length about the NHI and how just impossible it is, but you're looking at something that not only will taxpayers in the sense of personal and company tax be required to contribute to this, to create an equal provision of medical services, which is just probably nigh impossible. But we estimate it could cost about up to 750 billion rand to set up. Now, as you say, can you imagine what one would do with that sort of money in government? Now, one of the issues that's come up is that the CEO of Discovery and the chairman, Adrian Gore, have both sort of taken a position, publicly to say, don't worry, it's not going to happen soon. There are way too many hurdles to go through, and et cetera, and it just worries me that from the word go, by and large, the medical aids have not been very apparently supportive of us as their customers for a start. And one question is, what are they going to do with our money? And Discovery in particular has seemed to be fairly supportive of government, probably because they want to play a role in its administration. And the only time that I've seen Gore being critical is when the bill was approved by the committee that deals with it, with almost no changes from its previous iteration. And obviously the business sector, or certainly Discovery, expected some changes. Harry, what's your feeling about business involvement, and particularly medical aids, and the fact that they hold our money? Are they going to just hand it over, what we've put in so far, or are we going to be able to stop them, or should we be able to stop them?
Yeah, I think this speaks to the problem that business in South Africa have been very lenient towards the government's plans to intervene in the economy. They've often tried to placate the government, and they just simply haven't voiced their criticisms enough to sway government or to push government away from harmful policies such as the NHI. And it's ironic because surveys in recent years have shown that of all institutions in South Africa, the institutions that South Africans have the most trust in is not government or the opposition parties or the media. It is business. South Africans believe that business is the only way these days to save the country from abyss. And I will even refer to Astral Foods, which is the main employer in Standerton. They're essentially providing water, electricity, and roads in that town. And so business has, I think, at this point, they have a very, very pivotal role. On the one hand, ensuring service delivery, doing the government's job essentially, and on the other hand, they do have the resources and the scope to kind of, counter the government and tell the government that, listen, we can't keep going in the direction that you're pushing us into, because the NHI, it's not something that is supported by the majority of South Africans. I mean, we've seen that when impoverished families, when they do get the means to afford private healthcare, they immediately make that switch. They immediately move away from state healthcare and towards private healthcare, because they simply don't have confidence in the government providing essential services. So medical institutions such as Discovery really need to put their best foot forward and be a voice for their clients, because at the end of the day, it's the man on the ground that's going to suffer the most from NHI.
Yeah, well, that what you've said and what we've raised so far was captured in pretty much in a letter from a reader. I think it was, I can't remember, it was News 24 Business Day, exactly talking about Discovery and the issues we've raised. But the second part, he says, at its heart, it's simply not correct to say that it is inequitable for working middle-class people to buy a medical service that suits their pockets and needs, and for poorer and unemployed people to rely on the state. That's as it should be, the state stepping in and using taxpayers' money to support those who cannot afford an alternative. The only thing that everyone should have been saying from the beginning to Deputy DG Nicholas Crisp, through to every passing politician, is do better. Wrecking what works in favor of some ideological but unfunded utopia in a relatively poor country with a small tax base is simply reckless. Chris, your comment on that, and I just want to ask you, I've never quite understood, and being the economics person, you can probably help me out here. Contributions to medical aid are essentially after tax. You are already, through your taxation, paying for public health, and I don't think anyone would gainsay that, other than the fact that public health is extremely badly run. This is after tax money we've been paying. The minister seems to think that we have some sort of divine obligation to pay this money, and as the writer says, the tax base is depleting.
Yeah, that's part of the narrative that has come with the NHI through many years now, where the focus has been on how the minority of the country, sort of race makeup, income makeup, the minority can enjoy the benefits of private care, where the majority have to use public care. I don't know if the narrative, those who perpetuated, realized they could change their own narrative if they actually fixed public healthcare facilities for those who can't afford private medical schemes, for example. Numerous problems in both private and public care, highlighted by the health market inquiry of a few years ago, that hasn't been implemented. That requires actual hard work to fix the issues that ail public care. But much easier to say you're going to fund, quote unquote, free universal care for all citizens, and have that again to use on the road to the elections next year. Of course, we have to keep in mind, in the context of a general election next year, where the ANC is projected to get under 50%, it needs as many selling points to voters as possible that it can market. Whether it can actually implement the NHI or not, perhaps is irrelevant for the PR. But the ANC can now show NHI, Employment Equity Amendment, at least those two core deliverables of the National Democratic Revolution, that they have pushed them through. They have come through the National Assembly. That's a very useful narrative tool in that regard. On the letter, that excellent letter that you highlighted, Sara, yeah, I think there's been maybe it's a sense of guilt on the part of bigger business, big corporates, that they have to play on the government's turf, wait for government to set the terms of engagement, and then go along with that to sort of say we agree with NHI in principle, we have issues around the implementation, but we will work with you. But then you sort of cede, number one, the moral high ground, but also the sort of practical impetus and the rules of engagement, as it were. So on the issue of, let's take the biggest issue now with funding with the NHI. As the CEO of Discovery has highlighted yesterday and today, and he's correct in doing so, there's no legal mechanism to allow the taking of the funds in medical aids, essentially trusts, to put them into the NHI fund that would fund the NHI. But number one, I don't know that the government in general, at least this current government and administration, is concerned with issues of whether something is legal or not. I don't know if that's the biggest stumbling block for them. And secondly, why won't they just change or implement that in different ways to circumvent the sort of legal requirements or issues? That's how we've seen when they couldn't get the 18th constitutional amendment bill through around expropriation without compensation. They then went for the expropriation bill route, the land court bill route, the sort of entry, the unlawful entry onto premises bill, different ways around where they've been blocked through the constitution and other sort of quote unquote legal routes. I don't know if that's a big consideration for the ANC at this point in time. So whether bigger business, big corporates realize, like Discovery, that they're trying to dictate terms, they want to look like they're willing to work with government, they want to look progressive. That's all well and good for optics, but at the end of the day, you see all the impetus. And when things become dire enough and difficult enough, when government needs more funds to fund whatever it needs to roll out, and mostly that'll be through corruption and wastage, those funds then will be the first point of call. And no matter what you've said, you will say, but you promised us this, but you promised us that. That's not going to be the case. Just the last point sort of on the NHI is just that it'll be all well and good for people who can afford to go overseas to afford their care. But in general, this idea of monopolizing the management of all healthcare in the hands of the state, a few years after, I say after, state capture, where none of those incentives has changed, none of those systems have changed. You have an NHI fund, the board members of which the Minister of Health can appoint, no transparency and oversight from Parliament. Why would the incentives and the outcomes be any different?
No, and then the government's, there to be, the ANC is there to be in power forever. So whatever's going to keep people there, they're probably going to take it. Harry, just the issue that Chris raises about the fact that health, first of all, you're going to see an exodus of doctors if the system comes into play, because choice for them to practice their professions is going to be reduced substantially. But also, it seems health is the one thing that the middle class will not, I don't think, will put up with. They will immigrate if they can.
No, absolutely right. I mean, there have been numerous surveys now since the idea of NHI came up, where these surveys asked, medical professionals, would they decide to partake in the NHI or opt out of it? And the majority of medical professionals said that, listen, it's not going to create a conducive environment for me to do my job properly. So if the NHI does get implemented, I'm leaving South Africa. And so we're going to see a huge exodus of very skilled medical professionals. And that, of course, is going to create a lot of anxiety for middle-class South Africans who rely on these private institutions for healthcare. I mean, Hattingh, for example, the economic powerhouse of the country, that's the province where private hospitals outnumber state hospitals. And it just shows how heavily middle-class households located in urban areas rely on private healthcare. So no, absolutely, many middle-class families and taxpayers are going to. This will be the final. This will be the final thing that forces them to let go of their South African citizenship and pay their tax somewhere else.
Going on to our next topic, not a lot to be said about it in the sense that we know what has been discussed about the possibility of the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act being withdrawn from South Africa and it no longer being able to benefit from the American market and the benefits that are applied to it. But what has happened is that a bipartisan group of American legislators is demanding that this year's summit, Agoa Summit, be moved away from South Africa and warned that the country is in danger of losing its Agoa status. Basically, one of the comments from one of the economists here said that, you know, it could be catastrophic and Russia effectively could bankrupt South Africa. Chris, are they being a little over the top, or do we deserve the possibility of what we may get?
Arguably not being over the top, because the current ANC government is the world leader in undermining its own economy. So even if we lose AGOA, the government itself, I think, is doing quite well to ensure that things go quite badly for economic growth, for job creation, for all that sort of thing. I think let's assume this happens. Let's assume the forum, the summit, is moved. It's scheduled for November this year. Let's assume it's moved to another African country. It's a sort of first step on a ladder that the US Congress can pursue in terms of dealing with its frustrations with the South African government, not number one, not condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but secondly, talking about being non-aligned, but not practicing that non-alignment. So not engaging in actual peace talks. I mean, you've got your national sovereignty. That's right. You should have that freedom, but then you should actually sort of practice what you preach, as it were. So let's assume we lose AGOA. We lose those export market, that duty-free export to the US. To me, it's the biggest signal that it will send to investors globally, given the global context of high inflation, lower investment, lower gross fixed capital formation, that maybe South Africa is not the best country with which to trade or invest in. It's the sort of steady ratcheting up, another own goal, another burden that we add onto the South African economy, South African businesses, making it more difficult for them to operate, impacting on things like job creation, investment down the line. I don't think this necessarily means that we'll see something like secondary sanctions. It depends, again, on the South African government's own actions going forward. It depends on whether the narrative in Washington, the impression changes. But for the time being, I think this is the US steadily trying to ratchet up the pressure, as it were. It follows on from Ambassador Brigatti's comments. It's a way for the US to find out what is actually going on. Let's see some action. Let's just see some action, whether it's positive or negative from our perspective. Let's see if the government realizes there's something going on here. Will they act or not? Obviously, we don't want to lose AGOA, but in the longer term, it signals a turning away from relatively more open, democratic, technologically advanced, economically free countries towards those which are lesser so. And then you lose the benefits thereof. So the skills sharing, the transfer of technology and capacity, manufacturing capacity, you start to lose those things over time.
Here, it seems to be a case where almost the symbolism will do the work for us. The symbolism of the very, very, what appears to be very close relationship to Russia, which offers us very little in the way of trade. I mean, really very, very little in the way of trade. Is this just a case of sort of, you know, sort of feeling warm, having warm and fuzzy feelings about the Russia which was preceded by the Soviet Union, which did support the ANC during the struggle?
Yeah, I think a lot of the policies that we see in ANC documents, they originated from, you know, the Soviet Union, and so there is a ideological camaraderie between South Africa and the Russian Federation. There's this idea almost that the Soviet Union, it's something that still needs to be idealized, and the way that the Soviet Union operated, that's something that the government should somehow implement here in another version or in another form. But the problem is that we've seen that those types of policies have completely failed everywhere where it has been implemented. And if South Africa, I mean, there've been talks that South Africa is becoming too rich to be part of AGOA. And there's also this idea that, or this argument that only 8% of South African US trade, only the US trade and US and South African trade only is 8%. That's what I'm trying to say. But so if we lose the AGOA status, it won't be such a major negative setback. But if the European Union decides to follow the US in clamping more severely down on trade between us and them, then South Africa is in for we're in big trouble then, because yes, China might be our biggest trading partner, but the EU, the United States, together, just the economic benefits are just way more superior than our relations with China and Russia. But the fact that we are kind of trying to change our orbit to become closer to Russia and China kind of, I think, speaks to the government's on the one hand, their warm fuzzy feeling about being closer to China and Russia, but also that they don't really care that much or really take the economic repercussions of such diversion seriously for the country, unfortunately.
It strikes me that we're supposed to be too rich to be part of AGOA, but as Chris said, we're very successfully becoming poorer. Maybe we'll become poor enough to remain part of AGOA at the rate we're going. Sort of going to that part of the world, I would entitle the last piece, Mr. Cele goes to Beijing. Now, our esteemed Minister of Police has gone to visit China with a delegation of senior officials. I do not know how large that delegation may be, but let's assume the worst. They are there to discuss policy matters, the strengthening of China-South Africa practical law enforcement cooperation and collaboration, and they want to engage on key safety and security role players in China. Harry, really? China for law enforcement? I'm sure law enforcement, there's nobody to touch China. The only problem is every freedom, every right in the Constitution would be breached in the observance, including the death penalty. What do they think they could possibly? Do they think the Chinese will take them seriously even?
Yeah, it's quite funny why we are. What are we doing in China to understand how to better improve our policing? I think it's just another way for the government to open communication channels or to strengthen communication and dialogue between us and China, because as we've now mentioned in the previous section, South Africa does want to get into that China orbit and get very close to countries such as China and Russia. I think it's ludicrous for us to go to other countries to learn about how to do or to improve our own policing here in this country when we already know what we should be doing. What is very clear from the get-go is that the South African Police Service has a huge problem with cadre deployment and corruption. Now, the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, IPID, shows us each year the number of complaints that is received regarding police officers. And I believe in the previous year, there were over 6,000 complaints that or reports that were made against the police. And the outcomes of those investigations are quite poor. There's no proper accountability being taken. So corruption in the police runs rampant, unfortunately, in South Africa, and that's why most South Africans, both rich and poor, have lost confidence in the SAPS. So that's not something that we need to go to China to fix. That's something that we can easily do with better appointments made in the police service, creating a better chain of command, improving accountability. When you do these basic steps, you will see a complete change in the way the SAPS functions. So yeah, I guess it's curious why Minister Cele believes that China can help us with this matter.
Chris, one of our audience members suggests that the ANC needs the Russians to keep paying for the ANC. But could it be that the ANC needs the Chinese to pay for the mistakes of government?
Yeah, 100%. The long game here, I think, is China. All this talk of the global south, mostly on the part of South Africa, and a multipolar world. When you become further alienated from bodies like the IMF, the World Bank, G7 nations, and you have a deficit that is projected to reach 7, 8, 9% in the coming years to fund all that debt repayment for all your glorious welfare programs, for all your patronage networks, you need someone to borrow that money from. And where you're going to go, possibly to other bodies, other countries. And I think that's the longer game. The Minister of Police now going to China. Maybe the ANC wishes they could implement a sort of totalitarian state to that level. Thank goodness they are inept, that they can't do anything to that sort of level. But also, not just the Minister of Police going, but also our Minister of Electricity, or no electricity. He is also going in the coming weeks to secure our supply line, our pipeline of solar panels. Because instead of, we talk about localization and we don't want to be too dependent on the West and we want to up our manufacturing capacity. Instead of actually doing that and implementing the right systems and incentives for that, we just want to be dependent on another foreign country, another force, as it were, to import our solar panels. So it's all pivoting, I think, in that direction. And it will be exacerbated by the more desperate the ANC becomes to retain control of patronage networks, access to state resources. Should they come in under that 50% next year in the elections, this contestation will be ever more, I think, clear as we go, and that'll help to drive more wedges within the party. So in turn, in the long term, depending on where one wants to look for the optimism and the light points, it undermines the capacity and the viability of the ANC as a sort of organized one whole over the long term.
Yeah. No, I think that's probably right. And another day, another load of good news. I'm sure we'll come to you with something equally astonishing tomorrow. But that's all we have time for today. I'm going to encourage you to read our writing on dailyfriend.co.za, and see you, if not personally, generally speaking, see you tomorrow.